Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. Our broadcast today features a conversation from our most recent Metis Strategy Digital Symposium on the topic of digital platforms as strategic growth drivers. The conversation featured Shri Santhanam, the Executive Vice President and Global Head of Analytics and Artificial Intelligence at Experian, and Anjana Harve, the Global Chief Information Officer of Fresenius Medical Care. The gentleman who led that conversation was the Vice President and Head of Metis Strategy's West Coast office, Chris Davis. Chris, welcome and great to see you.
Thank you. You too, Peter.
Well, Chris, what an interesting topic you covered at our symposium, digital platforms as strategic growth drivers. Talk a bit about this. There's a fair amount that's written about the power of platforms. We all use them in various ways in our personal lives as well. And there's what's sometimes less understood is the implications of this in B2B organizations also. But give a brief overview, if you would, as to why you thought this was an interesting topic for us to tackle.
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating, Peter, and we talk about this in the interview itself, but for the first decade of the 2000s, there was a big emphasis on platforms, and it was largely driven by the ERPs. But what happened was the platform became a hammer and everything was a nail. And what you ended up with was this gargantuan monolithic application that tried to solve all problems. But as is the case for many circumstances, when you try to do everything for everyone, you do very little well for anyone. And then in the next decade, the 2010s, there was this distaste that grew. Cloud capabilities grew in popularity and capability. And you got this notion of, let's go best of breed. And best of breed brings its own challenges. You have integration patterns, you have different data models, and you start to lose some of the value of common knowledge, common skill sets. And so what Shri and Anjana talk about is the notion of platform-based thinking, platform-based strategies as an unlock to scale, and why platforms are different now than they were in the early 2000s. And so it's just a really interesting way to think about how you can compete on a totally different axis in two very different industries and circumstances.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that as well. We'll obviously hear in long form the conversation as it unfolded, but what interesting companies these are. Shri Santhanam from Experian, as I mentioned, Anjana from Fresenius Medical Care. So very different organizations, but both for which the idea applies. Again, in brief, as we'll hear it in long form momentarily, talk a bit about the power of their stories, if you would.
Yeah, so with Experian, most people will know them from their B2C capabilities. They're one of the big three credit bureaus in the United States. They also have a very large B2B aspect where they sell decision software, decision analytic capabilities to companies to make credit worthiness or risk-based decisions. What Shri talks about is when you're building from an innovation perspective, you need to pick the point in time when you start to move beyond use case driven to platform driven. And he talks about this healthy balance in product innovation and digital innovation as needing to be use case bound, obsess on solving a specific problem, but do so in a way that's portable and that will benefit a different levels of value and adjacencies. And so one of the examples that Shri talks about, which I just found so fascinating, is the way that Experian's done this to solve the problem of inclusive lending. And I won't steal his thunder, but listeners will enjoy that example. And for Anjana, being in the dialysis space, one of the biggest players in the world, but especially with a major footprint in the US, she talks about a platform-driven approach to deliver precision medicine for patients. And that might feel antithetical to take a wide-ranging platform approach, but for the care of one individual. But that's what the art of the possible is. And so this notion of delivering, empowering the care provider, the medical professional, and the patient to have the experience they need for their health is extremely powerful, and able to take those learnings of individual care and then port them over for the benefit of others starts to create a beautiful flywheel. And so both talk about examples of the way they've been able to, in their organizations, and some of the specific examples of business value they've delivered.
That's a great overview. Thank you so much, Chris. Well, without further ado, let's get to the conversation. Digital platforms as strategic growth drivers, featuring Shri Santhanam from Experian, Anjana Harve from Fresenius Medical Care, in conversation with Chris Davis.
Thank you, Peter. So a bit more on Anjana's background. Starting deep in the healthcare industry, she recently became the first global CIO of her organization. And for those who are less familiar, this is a company that operates 4,000 dialysis clinics across the world, serving 344,000 patients worldwide, which yields roughly 54 million dialysis treatments in just last year alone, enabling a network of patients, healthcare providers, and physicians across all of those operations. From Experian, Shri started out with product management in the technology industry, a stint in consulting, and leads their global analytics and AI products. And many of you are probably familiar with Experian as one of the 3 largest credit bureaus in the United States, but they also have a strong B2B aspect to what they do. It's not just B2B. And I have a personal story where I had a credit dispute, and I have to say experience for me was by far the best out of working with the 3 bureaus. But there's also a lot that the organization does in enabling and selling decision analytics, not just where are we right now, but how should people engage with consumers and businesses going forward? And that turns out to be roughly a $5 billion organization. And so where I'd like to start this discussion for Shri and Anjana is understanding, what do we mean by platform? Because it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And Shri, I'd like to start with you. You manage a book of business and the general manager of products and services that are sold to Experian customers. And I'm keen to get your thoughts on, how do we define the word platform for this conversation?
Yeah, it's an important question for us, Chris. And if I give a little bit of context to Experian, for about 100 plus years now, we've leveraged the power of data to bring sort of impact to business and consumers. But that reality is changing, particularly in the last decade and a half, where the value of core data in itself is slowly eroding. Now, we believe we have a very significant strategic moat around that. The pioneers who created the credit bureau had an immense amount of foresight, and that's not going away anytime soon. But value is migrating up the stack. So really the products, the services, what clients use our data for is starting to become quite sort of valuable. And the play for us is to step into that value chain and not offer our clients not just the data, but also the products and services which they utilize the data for, and to actually make their job sort of easier. A big part of that is bringing analytics and AI. So the whole question of how do we do that, platforms become very relevant. And if you start to deliver products like services on the back of your data in an ad hoc way, then that's not scalable. The economics don't quite work. And so for us, really a platform, and one of the key plays which like I kicked off when we started was to create a common foundation, both technical and commercial, around a set of problems that we want to tackle with products and services. So that's how we see a platform. It's a common foundation around technology and commercial. And it's different from traditionally what platforms were looked at like 15, 20 years ago, where really it's more of a customer-facing proposition saying, hey, buy my platform and you can get that. Most of our customers, if we went and told them that, they'd look at us funny and say, like, what are you trying to pull over me? Are you trying to lock me into something?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight, Shri, that your point on, in some ways, data is losing its value. And on the one hand, that almost feels like an antithetical point to the posters that you'll see of, oh, data is the new oil, data is the sole thing, but that value moves upstream. And what's really interesting about the comparison and contrast with Experian and Fresenius is there's different use cases. One is decision analytics about how people run their business in the future. But Anjana, a lot of the work that you're doing is enabling the patient experience in the moment and providing personalized care. And I'm curious if you could share, some of the examples that we talked about, whether it's the hub strategy or others, about how your organization is taking a platform-centric mindset, but to really deliver care to dialysis patients worldwide.
Sure, absolutely, Chris. I think if you think about Fresenius Medical Care, we primarily at the center of the entire strategy that we have is our patient, right? We're looking for how can we help our patient improve care and prevent things as much as we can or give them the right care. So the way we've been thinking about platforms is really what is the right platform for helping our patients manage their care, to providing their information and bringing the consistency across every interaction we have with them. So whether it's starting with the modality of early kidney disease care that starts chronic disease care, all the way to if they do end up having to go to dialysis treatment itself, it's the user journey that goes across, and we can have a platform that actually models that journey, if you will, and helps ease the pathway, if you will, as the patient goes from one modality to the other through this forum. And so we think about platforms in that way, and what we've been thinking about and the way we built our system is really the hub strategy, as you mentioned, which is at the core of it is the patient, but around that is patients, our care teams, which is integrated clinicians that we bring together to take care of the patients, as well as our providers, our nephrologists who come in and help. So thinking of those three, but all centered around sort of the patient, and how do we provide platforms that actually give that continuity of information, of insights, of making it easy for them to care, giving them and empowering them with the right data and insights to be able to manage things. So a very different way, I think, of thinking about it, but that connected health fabric, if you will, starts to help us to stitch and bring all the right people to help support that patient at the center.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about both answers that you shared is this healthy tension between solving for the common, but also the unique use cases. So in your example, Anjana, there's different personas. There's also different patients who are in their life cycle. And Shri, as you talked about, you don't lead with, hey, go buy my platform. Hey, here's a problem that I can solve. And so Shri, I'm really interested in your thought of how do you go about identifying those business use cases? How do you make that decision of what do I do, platform first versus use case first? How do you balance that tension in your product development, in your strategy conversations?
Yes, it's an important question. One you almost answered at the inception, so you never really have to ask or even revisit that question in a deep way, right? And my belief is, like, often if you're asking the question of a platform saying, can I identify more use cases, the platform's already become defunct, right? So in my mind, as like Anjana pointed out, like you create a platform on the basis of a theme of a family of problems that you really want to solve. In her instance, she's saying really it's about empowering and enabling sort of like the consumer and the health vision and a set of things around that. Like for us, the family of problems at Experian is there's a number of things around how lenders operate their business and the lending life cycle, which require AI, ML, data technology to come together. So our simple goal is to ensure that we can create a foundation which accelerates and really like reduces like 10, 20x the time to really stand up those products and services. If you frame it that way, then you answer that question once in the beginning, and after that it's moot, because really you go into that pool and say, okay, what's the next product and service I can to make my lender's life better, or where can I go instead of help instead of do that, right? So it's very different from the sort of platform plays you saw in the early 2000s with SAP, which is like, oh, I've got this technical foundation, let me think about how I can use that technology, right? So the platform is becoming more of a foundation around a business problem or a theme of values or a set of things which we can do. I also think the other reason for that is in the early 2000s, you had just technology was at a different place. Just having two products have a common data foundation, or products talk to each other, or like having BI, like that was like a royal pain. So you needed like SAP to just get reports. You don't need that anymore now. Like most like well-designed microservices like can talk to other things, like they're API based. They can read into data from S3 buckets. So the notion of a platform saying I can get common reporting, all of that is like rapidly eroding, right? I think if it's purely to have bits of technology talk together, right, increasingly that value with well-architected microservices is diminishing. So for us at Experian, the hard problem that the platform solves is to stand up products powered by ML and AI on our sort of data, there's actually a suite of componentry that we want to actually build foundationally and make available, right? Like a gradient boosted tree model, which runs on credit disk data and which can be trained. Like building it 5 times over in different sort of products is like very hard. So you actually want to make that component available, and like for a bunch of problems which solve lending, you want to be able to bring that. So that's really how we think about use cases in the platform and what we do.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shri. And Anjana, I want to circle back to you. So we talked about the hub strategy, and there's also a mirror of that we're now unpacking from a hub operating model, where there's this federated notion of core central capability, but also enabling innovation at the edge. How have you built your team and your skill sets in order to enable that, so that there isn't just a bottleneck at the center for those common components that Shri was talking about, but there's also people who can own an actual outcome and be obsessive about delivering value to the patient, to the healthcare provider?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we're actually in the middle of that, Chris, as we're thinking of the operating model and how we organize ourselves. I go back to what Shri said, and I think our entire strategy is really built on what I would call role-centric experiences. It really comes back to the problem we're trying to solve, but in this case, the care we're trying to provide in my industry and my care, my use case, if you will. But looking at those role-centric, but workflows that kind of go through it, right? It's not just the experience, it's about how you go about doing it. What are the types of insights you provide all along the way? So that being at the core of the strategy, we're trying to reorganize our operating model around experiences as well as platforms. So platforms give us the ability to standardize, scale, get commonality of ease of pulling everything in, but moving all of the differentiation through our experiences to the edge through the experience teams. And through experience, and I know one of the panels on the earlier one, I talked about, it's about experiences, it's about processes, it's about workflows, embedding insights into that. So it becomes part and parcel. It's not a report I go afterwards and go look for what should I be doing, looking back in the rear view mirror. It's all about guided sort of ways of improving care in my particular case. So how do you make that part of the workflow so it actually starts to guide the clinician to perhaps look at things a certain way, or not just that can be provided to a patient and how they want to be looking at their own care, things like that. So really we're pivoting ourselves into much more what I would call experiences/process, depending on the type of use case that we have, to platform teams to enable that agility for us to drive standardization on one side, but at the same time kind of bring innovation, speed, agility into how we're thinking and providing the right services to our end users, if you will.
Yeah, that's great. And we've talked about thematically the role of platform. We've talked about the operating model, but now I want to drill into a specific use case. We all read the news, and if you just looked at a few sources, you might be led to believe that large technology platforms are all designed for evil. And Shri, I think in our prep conversations, one of the things that you highlighted is what Experian is doing around enabling inclusive lending. And Anjana, we talked a lot about personalized healthcare. And so there are virtues that we can drive in platform-based approaches. And Shri, I just want to invite you to talk a little bit about how Experian is tackling the opportunity or challenge of enabling inclusive lending, please.
Sure, and just a bit of context for sort of folks. If you look at the US population today, roughly sort of around 25% of the population falls into the category of what people commonly refer to as credit invisibles. So traditional methods of risk-based lending and assessment just don't have a way of assessing these sort of folks. And like as a consequence, they don't have access to some of the most fundamental financial instruments needed to lead everyday lives, to build businesses, to be successful as an individual. I think for many of us on this call as sort of immigrants, perhaps sort of first generation immigrants, that problem's fairly close to home. You can show up with very good education, very good sort of prospects, and you go to the credit bureaus and like they just don't know you, and like you can't even open a credit card with a $2,000 limit. And that's a core sort of fundamental problem. So why does that arise? I think that arises because the data, the analytics, the models, the ecosystem of that and what sort of helps the large financial institutions assess sort of risk. They're not sophisticated enough to take in that sort of additional information. And a big part of what we're doing with the platforms we're building is enabling that financial inclusion. And that includes 3 or 4 things. First, bringing additional sources of data other than just the traditional credit files we had, additional data to get better information for sort of consumers and lenders. Additional information which on the decisioning side as well, many of the lenders use a set of antiquated rules and policy decisions which were right for the time in which they were sort of created, but now sort of are no longer relevant. And really sophisticating the models, like it's funny, in the main, a significant number of lenders still use like either standard scores or traditional logistic regression models. But to build an ML-powered model, a gradient boosted tree, or something more sophisticated, which can have much higher discriminatory power, is expensive. It's a bit like consumer retail experience like 20 years ago, where unless you are Amazon, you didn't quite have the technology and the capabilities to do that. So right. Big part of our mission is to provide universal access to state-of-the-art lending, data, analytics, and technology, and to bring that down the chain. The top 10, 20 banks will probably have some flavor of this, but there's over 2,000 mid-sized lenders and like 5,000 to 10,000 of lenders and about 300 million consumers dependent on those folks. And our mission is to enable that financial inclusion and fundamentally help people have access to credit.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that, Shri. And Anjana, we only have about a minute left in our session, but can you please maybe expand on one of the use cases in the way that you're delivering that personalized medical care as well?
Sure, absolutely. So when you think about personalized care around a patient, it's many aspects of it. One is looking at the 360-degree view of the patient. So we have, just given the complexity of a kidney disease itself, they're meeting a nephrologist, they're meeting a social worker, the dietitian. They have information that they have got that they want to be put in on how their lifestyle and things like that. So really taking a 360-degree view of the patient, a longitudinal view of the patient. So you may end up going to a hospital versus you're being taken care of in a clinic. How do you bring all of that information as well as wearable information, things like that? So we're really looking at how do we stitch the best of all of that data to provide the most relevant, most personalized information, both for care for the patient, as well as insights and recommendations for a clinician who's taking care of the patient, to provide them different pathways. So many different aspects. I think it's fairly complex. A lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of data points that have to come together to be able to provide such insights. But it's been a fascinating journey for us as we've thought about how do we really make this all about personalized care for the patient.
Just this has been such an action-packed 20-minute discussion. I wish we had more time, but to summarize, we need to start with a platform-based strategy, be use case driven, enable a platform product management structure, enable to federate innovation at the edge, but not lose sight of the problems that we're solving. Anjana and Shri, thank you so much for participating today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.